Born in 1893 in Barcelona, Spain, Joan Miró belonged to a generation faced with the inheritance of the 19th century isms that had liberated painting from its job of depicting recognizable subjects. However, by the time Miró was ready to open the door of the art world, Cubism had already disassembled and reconstructured the picture space and its subject matter, and Dada had just dynamited art's meaning. Les Fauves had stopped using paint to show nature and had begun using nature to show paint. In short, the academic art world was under attack, and some enemy camps had already formed. Young artists had to decide about their allegiance. Then they had to find their own artistic identities. Joan Miró's father was a goldsmith and watchmaker from Tarragona. Miró's father left his native village for Barcelona, where he switched to precious metals and built up a very successful business. Miró's mother was the daughter of a cabinet maker from Palma de Mallorca. A reserved and dreamy child of fragile health, Miró was a poor student at school. He started drawing classes at the age of 7. During the same year, he began what became an annual trip to his grandparents, thus exchanging the city of Barcelona for the more provincial Catalan surroundings. The inhabitants were simple farmers. The many sketchbooks Miró saved from his youth show accurate, if unremarkable, observations of village streets and architecture, as if he were memorizing the places he saw. Later, as an adult, he would continue to return to the countryside of his childhood for long periods, usually during the summer and fall. In 1907, when Miró was only 14 years old, the question of his future career loomed against the horizon line, marked by the unsuccessful end of his secondary schooling. His father strongly suggested business classes. He attended them, but he also simultaneously attended the famous art academy where Picasso's father had taught, and Picasso himself had been briefly enrolled 9 years earlier. After the 17-year-old Miró had completed his business schooling, he began a job as a bookkeeper. Miró later writes about this period in his life. Fights with the family, give up painting to work in an office, catastrophe, do drawings on account books, and I am fired, naturally. At 19, I enter the Gulf Academy in Barcelona to devote myself entirely to painting. Although Miró's family was in good financial shape, they did not intend to support Miró all too generously in his resolution to become an artist. In 1915, Miró entered the military in Barcelona for an abbreviated stint and fulfilled his required service for 3 months of every year till 1917. View of Montreuil, 1917. He spent the remaining part of the year working in a studio in Barcelona that he shared with a friend, and in Montreuil, a village in the province of Tarragona where his family had bought a farm in 1911. Montreuil became a center of authenticity against which Miró measured the power of his art. Miró's early work is caged in by his knowledge of contemporary art. The Fauves especially influenced him, that group of expressive colorists who carried Van Gogh's vision even further, and whose most famous member was Henri Matisse. Miró used the accepted genres of still life, portraits, and landscape to exercise his fledgling style. Sometimes, in what is probably the earliest surviving oil painting by Miró, The Farmer, from 1914, the heavy brushstrokes lie clumsily next to one another and tend to obscure the motif without having any saving graces of their own. The viewer can almost feel Miró struggling to coordinate the paint, his hand, and his eye. His first one-man show at Dalamou's gallery ran for 3 weeks, from January to February 1918, and contained 64 canvases and many drawings dating from 1914 to 1917. Some of the work was damaged in the violent reaction to the images. Perhaps the portrait of E.C. Ricard from 1917 was among the paintings exhibited. It incorporated a Japanese print in the background with the glaring colors of the fauves. The bold abstract patterning of Ricard's clothing almost crushes the delicate, flowing lines of the image behind him. His face is cartoon-like, but also suggestive of Romanesque portraits in its frontality and linear stylization. In a picture like Kirana, 1917, painted in the hilly landscape near Montreuil, Miró has put aside nature's palette. The individual brushstrokes have integrated themselves into a rhythm of bright, broken colors that dip and rise in groupings of flat strip patterning. Miró has almost done away with illusionistic space here. He seems to be testing out color theories in his abstract contrasting of yellows and greens and blues and purples. Another work from 1917, North-South, a still life, reveals a bit of Miró's cultural and inspirational background. Arranged in a centrifuge of color, a tabletop, there are hints of folk art, song, growth, collage, and literature. Standing nude. Later, in 1918, Miró and some of his like-minded friends finally ended up forming their own group within the Saint-Luc group, which they named after the painter Gustave Courbet, whom they admired for his radicality. View of a Farm, 1918. From July to early December 1918, Miró remained in Montreuil. He painted 4 landscapes from around the farm: the vegetable garden with donkey, the brick factory, the house with the palm tree, and the wagon tracks. The vegetable garden with donkey is rich in detail, reflecting Miró's treasuring of small things. The wagon tracks. Miró said of this painting, "It is a slow appreciation of the manifold nuances, the concentrated glory of the sun. It is a joy to await an understanding of a blade of grass in the countryside. This blade of grass that is equally as beautiful as a tree or a mountain." The landscapes share a naive treatment of details, combining the way things are counted out and included with delicate decorative patterning. His colors have changed, become more natural and earthen. Seated Nude, 1919. The picture's debt to cubism is apparent in the faceted handling of the arms and upper torso. Yet, however profound Miró's admiration for the cubists, he was not, in his own words, derooted by them. In 1919, Miró painted a puzzling image, a self-portrait, in which he is wearing the same collarless red shirt that Vincente Nubiola has in Miró's portrait of him. On Miró, it looks like silk pajamas. It flaps open at the throat, exposing a sensual expanse of neck and a small yet vital angle of chest hairs. Somehow he appears almost undressed. In comparison with the loud portrait of E.C. Ricard 2 years ago, Miró has captured a soft, hushed atmosphere here. The dimples, folds, and swells of his young face appear chiseled, his hair impeccably trimmed and combed into the semblance of an oiled cap. Miró did not execute many portraits, and this, apart from a further self-portrait from 1917, is the only painting of him as a young man. It shows the Miró who arrived in Paris in 1920, 27 years old, and determined to grow beyond existing schools of Parisian painting. Perhaps that is what Picasso thought too when he bought the picture that year. A strong contrast between supporting base and things shown is demonstrated by the table Still Life with Rabbit of 1920. While the table and the space around it have been broken down into stylized angular shapes, the rabbit, fish, vegetables, grape leaves, and chicken are quite realistically painted. Of the objects on the table, only the inanimate wine jug has been conquered by style. Strangely enough, the animals still look alive, although they are probably meant to be food. Miró arrived in Paris after considerable preparation and careful consideration of just how he could finance his stay there. He lived in a hotel run by Catalans, where many Catalan intellectuals stayed. Miró did not have a studio, which didn't matter since he was not able to paint. The city had simply overwhelmed him. In July of 1920, he was back on the farm in Montreuil and began to work inspired by the jolts he had received in Paris. Still, it was the second trip to Paris that actually brought about a change in his work. In 1921, he managed to take over a Paris studio from the Spanish sculptor Pablo Gargalo. In April, Miró had his first exhibition in Paris. It was at the Galerie Licorne, which was known for its avant-garde shows. Not a single picture sold. In a painting like Standing Nude from 1921, Miró has placed the female figure upon a construct of a parallelogram and rhombus, with her left foot resting upon a black rectangle. Behind her is a field of squared-off blue that has been set off by squared-off bars of black, one of them interrupted by a white line that retraces its angular shape. Her breasts appear piercing and hard, like bullets. At the same time, her frozen gesture and the delineation of her anatomy has a Romanesque quality, such as in the circular kneecap and the partitioning of her body. Miró's famous painting and so-called key to his work, The Farm, was also begun in 1921. It contains numerous abstract elements and correspondences that would be hard to explain without the new influence. A. For example, the black circle and the white base of the eucalyptus tree in the middle of the painting. B. The red square to its right defying the depth of the chicken coop it describes. C. The red tiles and rhomboid section of black to the lower left. D. And even the round moon. Could the sun be that pale? The red wagon wheel and the rooster's perch. E. Right in the foreground, Miró has placed a red spouting watering can for whom a bucket has tipped its skirt. F. Behind it is a French newspaper whose name, L'Intransigeante, the uncompromising, is truncated by a fold so that only the syllable meaning into or within remains. Referring as it does to the watering can under which it has been placed, it seems to be a written instruction to the male moistener. G. If we follow the tiles and small path to the back, we see 7 imprints of bare feet that stop suddenly without having got any further. H. The path, however, continues along to a square well or water trough. A woman is leaning over it, and there are a few pots, a bucket, and a bottle near her. Behind her, and positioned almost in the middle of the painting like its perspective point, is a squatting, idol-like figure, hairless and naked, fetal and frog-like, with extreme shadowing on one half of its body. I. Behind the well is a pump or mill that is powered by a mule harnessed into a circular tract, going around and around, not getting anywhere, but still accomplishing something. J. The rooster, the rabbits, and the goat add sexual aspects, but they are also details of life on the farm at Montreuil. K. The vegetation is sparse. Either the crops are somewhere else, or the farm, unkempt as it appears, is no longer working. On the lower left, a huge wild plant erupts into bloom. It may well be the large type of Algrave cactus that flowers only once every 7 years in a cycle of slow but dramatic fertility. L. The farm is dominated by the light, framing buildings of the chicken coop and stall and the eucalyptus tree in the center. In one sense, it is a highly architectural painting because it is so carefully constructed. Miró reworked the painting many times, bringing it with him to Barcelona and Paris. The Carbide Lamp, 1922. In this picture, Miró drastically reduces the objects to clearly delineated forms arranged against a flat background. While the lamp is slightly shaded, the fruit and grid are composed of lines only. The Ear of Corn, 1922, is a very reduced picture. It reflects Miró's formal interest in linear shapes, as demonstrated in the grains. The Farmer's Wife, 1922. Miró explains the circle next to the cat as an afterthought. I found that during the first stages of painting The Farmer's Wife, I had made the cat too big, and thus disrupted the picture's balance. That is the reason for the double circles and the two angular lines in the foreground. They look symbolic, esoteric, yet they have no fantasy character. A change had been building in Miró's work. From 1923, he began to invent a new cosmos of beings and symbols. In The Tilled Field, it is possible to still identify the farms in Montreuil. Yet the animals, house, fields, and plants have become disquieting presences, stretched, swollen, and barbed, sometimes even into ugliness. A large lizard with a dunce cap becomes a jack-in-the-box that pops out of a pipe in a startling greeting. The fish head has lost his body, suggesting a smelly odor and the proximity to the sea. The ear is a giant listener. The eye in the crown of the trees sees all. Barbs invite and dispel touch. Miró is showing how he loves his Catalan homeland with his body and its senses, yet the landscape seems ultimately to resist him. It awakens his reverence, but it is not paradise. The flags waving on the gnarled tree, Catalan, Spanish, and French, tip up in optimistic crescents. Birds wheel in the sky, next to a cactus tree's triangular crown. Freedom? The folded newspaper in the foreground says day using French, but a little night is falling diagonally onto the upper right-hand corner of the painting, where something is hanging, a large spider or perhaps only a leaf. The Hunter, 1923, is almost the same size as The Tilled Field, and it has some similarities in its placement of forms. The subject matter that belongs to these forms, however, has been somewhat changed. Obviously, even more of recognizable reality has been left behind. The abstract circular bases of the tree in the farm have developed themselves into the symbol for a tree. Here is large, light, and slightly irregular circle marked by a black point, a diagonal line, and a single leaf. It corresponds to the carob tree in the tilled field on the right side of the painting and also has an eye growing out of it. To the left, a stick figure resembling the cactus-like tree in the tilled field indicates a human figure, the hunter. He is wearing the traditional Catalan hat on his head and smoking a pipe. Several small tongues of flame which issue from his pipe and his rifle, as well as the flame next to his yearning heart, give him a passionate aura. The conical rifle that the hunter holds in the middle of the painting corresponds to the chimney of the house in the tilled field. The spider leaf object seems to reoccur as a sun egg in the hunter. The fish is larger, but still somehow missing its flesh body. It is made up of a head with tongue, whiskers, an ear and eye, a bowel, a genital, and a tail. These parts of its anatomy are connected by a straight line, much as are the remaining cones, triangles, and circles of the rest of the composition. Maternity, 1924. Head of a Peasant, 1924-25. In 1924, the year André Breton published the first Surrealist Manifesto, Miró made several more paintings in this vein. A relatively small canvas, Harlequin's Carnival, which Miró himself illustrated with a poetic text published in 1939 in the magazine Verve, brought this phrase to a climax. It continues the overall distribution of weights and counterweights in the form of amusing, invented creatures celebrating an indoor carnival. A mechanical guitarist plays the music, while the others play games. The characters are beginning to look familiar. An insect jack-in-the-box has popped up out of a trunk. A fish lies on the table. A ladder, flames, stars, leaves, cones, circles, spheres, and lines appear. Siesta, 1925. Here is a depiction of the world lost in significance. The structure of things, form, color, and line, is of supreme importance. Bathing Woman, 1925. In this picture, whose blue background is reminiscent of seascapes, the line takes on an important function. It no longer delineates surrounding frozen forms. It has itself become movement, leading the eye of the observer through the picture. Photo, That is the Color of My Dreams, 1925. Confrontation with surrealist poets in the years after 1924 played an important role in Miró's creative life. Words and sentences begin to people his canvases, an attempt to transcend painting and at the same time link with poetry. Painting, 1925. Person throwing a stone at a bird, 1926. Lines continue to take up the narrative. A fantasy figure throws a stone at a rooster. Lines suggest the arm's momentum, the path of the stone, and the rooster's flight. They direct the readability of the picture. Dog barking at the moon, 1926. The landscapes painted in 1926 show Miró as a colorist. Both colors of the background are deep, forming an effective contrast for the primary colors red, yellow, and blue. Landscape, The Hare, 1927. In 1927, Miró moved into a studio near Joan, Max Ernst, Paul Eluard, and René Magritte. Particularly Arp influenced Miró with his undulating silhouettes and the organic forms of its figures. The hare in this picture is one example of this influence. During a trip to the Netherlands, Miró visited the museums in Amsterdam, where he particularly admired the old masters of the 17th century. He bought a series of picture postcards of these paintings, which he took to Paris with him and used as a starting point for the series of Dutch Interiors of 1928. In the pictures Interior 1 and 2 shown here, Miró made use of Hendrik Marten Sorg's The Lutenist, as well as Jan Steen's Cat Dancing Lesson. At first sight, these pictures have little in common with the 17th century paintings. A closer look shows, however, that each form of the Dutch interior refers to part of the original painting. Miró attempted an exact transformation of all the details into the realm of the fantastic. In Dutch Interior 2, the windows and chairs are reduced, while the head of the figure on the left is 5 times bigger than its body. Color, too, has asserted itself against the original. Dutch Interior 1 and 2 present a recreation of the old masters in a modern language of form and color. In this way, Miró clearly illustrates what is possible in painting and present, as well as what is no longer possible. The Potato, 1928. In 1928 and 1929, Miró painted several metamorphoses of existing female portraits, using two-dimensional sources of inspiration. Perhaps he only had eyes for one woman in real life. In October 1929, Juan Miró was married to Pilar Juncosa in Palma de Mallorca. 9 months later, in July 1930, his first and only child was born in Barcelona, a daughter whom he gave the name of his sister and mother, Dolores. Portrait of Mrs. Mills in 1750, after Constable, 1929. This portrait is one of a series of imaginary portraits done according to historical portraits. As with Dutch interiors, Miró transforms them into his own fantastic form and language. In a painting of 1929, he chose a Spanish advertisement for a German diesel motor to create Queen Louisa of Prussia. The general shape of the motor resembled an upright female figure with protuberant breasts, a long skirt, and a very small head. She has been placed upon a canvas vibrant with contrasting colors, arranged in an exceedingly spare and unusually spatial situation. With a wife and child, Parisian life had become decidedly more difficult and more expensive. In Barcelona, Miró and his family lived in his childhood home, with trips to Montreuil and occasionally to Paris. The art market was suffering badly from the world economic crisis, and by 1932, Miró's Parisian gallerist Pierre Loeb could no longer buy or sell all of his paintings. By returning to his mother's house in Barcelona, his father having died in 1926, he could at least better his financial state somewhat. Although his work of the 30s was all less anecdotal, with a broader, simpler vocabulary of signs, Miró remains obligingly readable. For example, Painting of 1933 has made the collaged objects into little creatures that correspond to the original illustration of tools roughly in shape, but not in meaning. Painting, June 13, 1933. This picture, Composition, 1933, belongs to a series of large format paintings produced from paper collages. The cut-out collage parts were transformed by Miró into bright colors. This series of pictures represents some of his most abstract work. Miró, who led a peaceful and privileged life within his family, could still paint an image like the large, brilliantly colored Swallow Love in the winter of 1933-34, which was the design for a wall tapestry. As early as the 20s, Miró had begun to experiment with picture poems. Here, figures and word elements are linked by twisting lines. The word hirondelle, swallow, and amour, love, stand in front of the blue background as if written in the sky by an aeroplane or by the flight of a swallow. The free distribution of the parts of the body and forms creates an effect of liberation and openness, bird's flight, and the free fall of one or two persons. Figure, October 1934. In 1934, Miró began a series of pastels, some of which must be admitted are rather scatologic. He has made frequent use of genitals as symbols of his art, yet his attitude towards sex is fundamentally innocent and far from vicious. Head of a Man, 1935. Miró's humor turns quite malignant in this picture, surely one of the most savage works of Miró's career, modeled with uncanny firmness and skill, so that its effect is sculptural. Rope and People 1, from 1935, is a collage that continues the wild pictures. 4 vertical figures fill the vertical image. A man biting his own hand, a rope looping out towards his neck, and 2 bare-breasted women. Miró, who saw the rope as constricting and hurting the figures, used it as a symbol of violence. Painting, 1950. Here, the pieces of rope have been bound together to make large knots. They make a 3-dimensional relief out of the picture, making it appear as a precursor of the later Combine paintings of Robert Rauschenberg. Man and woman in front of a pile of excrement, 1936. shows more characters involved with each other in a science fiction-like landscape or windowless interior space. Their inventive forms, heightened by extreme color contrasts, express hysteric urges and reactions. After the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in July 1936, Miró returned to Paris, where his family joined him 1 month later. He was to remain in exile in France until 1940. At first, without a studio or place to live, Miró was forced to stay in a hotel. Because he could not paint, he began a journal in which he wrote poetry and prose. Still Life with Old Shoe, 1937. Miró began to work on a still life that he came to consider one of his most important paintings. He set up an empty gin bottle wrapped in a piece of paper with a string around it, a large apple with a fork stuck into it, a crust of black bread, and an old shoe on top of the table, and spent 5 months painting them. Since he had no studio, he worked on the mezzanine of Pierre Loeb's gallery. He also spent some time drawing nude models. Help Spain, 1937. This poster was designed by Miró in support of the Spanish struggle for freedom. The figure clenches its hand to form a huge fist, crude strength against the enemies of liberty. The self-portrait of 1937 shows Miró was seeing stars, and he was soon to begin a series of paintings that came to be known as the Constellations. At Varengeville-sur-Mer in Brittany, the American architect Paul Nelson had a house. Miró began a new stage in his work that had its source in music and nature. One of the finest works in this series of portraits is Portrait 1, 1938, with butterfly mouth and a star. After the linear discipline of the self-portrait, the painter returned in this picture to the forceful colors he had used with such assurance for many years. A nursery decoration, 1938, painted by Miró for the 3 children of Pierre Matisse, seems rather odd at first glance. Its subject matter seems so distraught and menacing. Yet, however malevolent the fanged animal at the right, the picture has an underlying gaiety and cohesive power which make it one of the most admirable of the artist's large-scale works. A dewdrop falling from a bird's wing wakes Rosalie, who has been asleep in the shadow of a spider's web, 1939. This picture belongs, as well as the escape ladder, to the so-called burlap series. Miró developed this typical world of figures on the coarse material, giving them poetic titles. At this time, Miró was leading a secluded life, dedicated to his art. The escape ladder, 1939, is a motif which can be repeatedly found in Miró's work. In the days of the onset of the Second World War, it may be understood as a metaphor for the search for an escape from threatening world events. The Nightingale's Song at Midnight and the Morning Rain, 1940. André Breton said about Miró's constellations, "They belong together and differ from one another like the aromatic or cyclic series of elements in chemistry. If one considers them both in their development and as a whole, each of them assumes necessity and value like a constituent in a mathematical series. And finally, they give the word series a special meaning by their uninterrupted and exemplary sequence." The Morning Star, 1940. Just before the Germans occupied France, it was possible for Miró to flee and regain the comparative safety of his mother country. He continued working on gouaches in Palma and Montreuil. They were generically titled The Constellations, after the completion of the 10th image in 1940. Awakening at Dawn, 1941. Here he uses linear tracery to link the dots defining the strange and amusing creatures staring out of the patterning. Limited areas are painted flatly in green, yellow, red, and blue, However, the black of the dots, some hourglass or bow shapes, and the lines dominate, floating clearly above a light surface that has been worked with washes and scratching to bring out its texture. The Poetess, 1940. The Woman and Birds in Front of the Sun, 1942. Painting, 1943. Stars, moons, suns, and figures are linked to form a delicate and close-knit cosmic network of signs in the series Constellations. He systematically alters the colors on their crossing of the lines. Red becomes black, black becomes red. The result is a pulsating of the forms in the background. Miró continually emphasizes his difficult search for compositional balance while working on this series. The Bullfight, 1945. When the Constellations were shown in January 1945, this series of 23 gouaches were the first European paintings to be shown in New York for some time. Despite their small formats and being executed on paper, they had been smuggled into the country in a diplomatic pouch, they made a tremendous impression upon their audience. Women and Birds at Sunrise, 1946. The Constellations were to have a profound effect on the New York School of Painting and change the work of artists such as Achille Gorky and Jackson Pollock. Miró's all-over distribution of forms, the variety of recurring elements, the application of automatic drawing principles, and the idea of working in series began to blossom in American paintings. During the war years, Miró had worked to a great extent on paper because materials were scarce and because paper could more quickly and easily be moved than canvases. Miró also works with ceramics, branding irons, and constructions with elements of nature such as trees, rocks, roots, plants, and flowers. At the end of the Second World War, Miró was not an aging survivor disappointed by tragedy, but rather someone impatient to experiment and expand. It is not surprising that Miró should choose the end of the war to mark a turning point in his career. At 52 years of age, he decided that the time had come to finally profit from his art. During much of 1945, Miró lived at Artigas's house, and a great part of his time was naturally spent on ceramics rather than paintings. Nevertheless, a number of important pictures date from this year, such as The Harbor. In 1946, he completed the beguiling little Women in the Night, which suggests a preparatory plan for a mural such as Miró was to create for the Cincinnati Hotel the following year. At the end of 1946, Miró finished The Woman and a Little Girl in Front of the Sun, a picture in which we are made fully aware of that strange interplay between careful definition and casual effects, which occurs in so many of the painter's works of recent years. The two central figures are concisely outlined against a pearly ground. Then, at the right, there is a dark form, suggesting a man with a sombrero, which, in its uncalculated spontaneity, puts one in mind of finger painting. At the bottom left, a white splotch of heavy pigment adds an impulsive liveliness to the image as a whole. The workings of Miró's imaginative processes are mysterious and unpredictable. In 1947, Miró traveled to the United States for the first time because his gallerist Pierre Matisse had secured a commission for him to execute a wall painting for the new Terrace Plaza Hotel in Cincinnati. A huge painting was needed, 10 feet by 33 feet, and Miró worked on it for 9 months in New York before it was shown there and then transported to the hotel for installation. Painted on a soft blue background, the mural was to become a virtual anthology of the forms, mostly in red, yellow, green, and black, by which Miró had been engrossed for some time. Despite his absorption in 2 large-scale commissions, Miró also completed a number of outstanding easel paintings at this time. Among them are the superbly luminous and poetic Red Sun, 1948. During 1950, Miró's reflections on the intricate problems of the Harvard mural may have had some influence on 2 charming pictures of medium size, Painting and The Personage and Moon. His interest in collage revived in a capital work with string and rope, The Composition, 1950, whose vaporous background provides a breathtakingly sensitive foil to the figures and chords painted on or affixed to the surface. Woman in Front of the Sun, 1950. Of course, the influence of the constellations was not untouched by the success of a major one-man exhibition of Miró's paintings in the Museum of Modern Art in 1941. Ladders Cross the Blue Sky in a Wheel of Fire, 1953. Despite the war, it had been possible to mount the large show by using works from American collections. The catalog mentions paintings, drawings, collages, objects, rugs, a tapestry, and etchings. It lists Miró's contribution to stage design and book illustration, his prints, exhibitions of his work, and a bibliography of articles about him. Although Miró could not go to New York himself, he had arrived there. In the 50s, Miró bought a house and a piece of land on Mallorca, where he had spent part of the war years with his wife's relatives. He commissioned his friend, the architect Joseph Louis Serre, to build him the large studio he wanted. The move to the new studio in 1956 meant consolidating his belongings, reviewing his ideas, and destroying or overpainting things he felt were not worth keeping. The beautiful new space opened up many possibilities for Miró, who continued to work almost incessantly in a disciplined fashion. He traveled to Paris, worked with Ortigas on ceramic projects, and went to the Megt Foundation in Saint-Paul-de-Vence and to Barcelona to execute a series of prints. He also began to make sculptures on a greater scale, which were sometimes cast in bronze at foundries in Barcelona and Paris. From 1953 to 1956, Miró produced around 200 ceramics with Ortigas. This was a prodigious effort, which may well have reached its climax of eloquence and power in the Portico of 1956. In 1957, the artist had published by Louis Broder in Paris a suite of 22 etchings, dry points, and aquatints entitled La Bague d'Aurore, many of them extremely fine work. Then for a long time he was preoccupied with making woodcuts for Paul Eluard's book of poems, À toute épreuve, originally published without illustrations. Miró's book has now been issued and constitutes one of the most triumphant feats of book illustration in our century. Considering the quality of À toute épreuve, no one could begrudge the time Miró spent on it rather than painting, and concurrently the artist produced some exceptional pictures, among them Coiffeur disheveled by the flight of constellations, 1954. Slightly later, the excellent picture Painting, in which appears part of the Jack-in-the-Box that Miró delightedly plays with in a sequence from Thomas Bouchard's film on the master. The Sunwall, 1955-58. At the beginning of the 50s, Miró and his friend Ortigas tested the possibility of using ceramics in his artistic work. In 1955, Miró was commissioned to design 2 long walls outside the newly built UNESCO building in Paris. As a contrast to the concrete architecture around them, he designed 2 ceramic walls in intensive colors. One of these was dedicated to the sun, the other to the moon or night. That year, Miró was awarded the Guggenheim International Award, which President Eisenhower handed over to him in May 1959. During the early 60s, Miró's paintings became emptier again, to the point where they resembled some of his work from 1925, when he executed almost monochromatic canvases with only a few emphatic accents. One of several large triptychs, Blue 2, 1961, and Blue 3, both show clearly delineated and indistinct black and red forms against a bright blue field. The viewer is tempted to read the three canvases as the flying saucer-like appearing and disappearing of the red bar. Time, space, orbits, but also microcosms invisible to the eye suggest themselves. Fleeing Young Girl, 1968. This 1968 Miró sculpture has many faces. During the late 60s, he made a great number of surprisingly fresh-looking sculptures, whose humorous mixture of objects and bright coloring made them into engaging pop personalities. The Woman and Bird, 1967. Miró often made his sculptures from objects and materials he found. He often put the parts together as models, which were then cast in bronze. Finally, Miró painted them in bright colors. His Majesty, 1967-68, does not look as if it could possibly be the work of a 75-year-old man. The sculpture park with labyrinth in Saint-Paul-de-Vence might be the best place to see all types of Miró's sculpture in the place he liked it shown the best, outdoors. In 1968, Miró designed a large ceramic mural and labyrinth of sculptures for the Mecte Foundation in Saint-Paul-de-Vence. The splendor of the ceramics has guided me. It's like sparks. And then the struggle with the elements, with earth, fire. I am definitely a fighter by nature. When you make ceramics, you have to be able to tame the fire. Juan Miró. Over 10 years later, in 1973, he painted May 1968, a delayed reference to the student revolution in Paris. It, too, combines and recharges spontaneous gestures and deliberate signs and comes up with a painting that looks as if it could have been done during the 80s. Personnage, Birds, Star, 1978. Miró once again imitates the elements that characterized many of his paintings. His later work adds a new quality to his world of signs, a far cry from the joyful figures of the previous years. Miró's output was prodigious. During his 90 years of life, he made at least 2,000 oil paintings, 500 sculptures, 400 ceramic objects, and 5,000 drawings and collages. Using lithography, etching, and other graphic techniques, he created about 3,500 images, which were mostly published in editions of 50 to 75. And all of them contain some part of Miró's Catalan home, expressed by the language he developed in time, always growing from his roots there. Juan Miró died on December 25, 1983, at the age of 90 years old.